I'm a member of the Strategic Investments team at Samsung's Global Innovation Center based here in New York. We focus on software and service startups and invest in seed through Series B rounds. We've been around for about 3 years, about 28 investments in our portfolio, and we look for companies that can have a strategic collaboration opportunity with a Samsung business unit. And I actually started my career working in emerging markets with export credit agencies and multilaterals like the World Bank, and did quite a bit of work in Lebanon, so very happy to be here.
Parker.
Hi, I'm a partner with 500 Startups, and we are, I believe, the most active seed investor in the Middle East in general, and have done a few deals in Lebanon with more in the pipeline, and are very excited about both the region and the country.
Mike.
I'm Mike, the founding partner of VentureLab. We're a cross-market virtual incubator. We make investments in about 14 companies, well, 12 to 14 companies a year, and specifically moving from emerging markets to mature markets and vice versa. So we have investments in about a dozen countries, and yeah.
So just to kick off, let's just start by situating emerging markets within the investment ecosystem as a whole. So Silicon Valley, we all talk about unicorns. Somebody this morning on the video described her company as a little unicorn because it sold for $10 million, which I don't think qualifies as a little unicorn. But and the Valley's become this kind of unicorn hunting investing ecosystem now. Do emerging markets even get onto your radar, in your top 5 focuses? And if they do, why do they? Anyone can start.
I think emerging markets, as much as the excitement has been around unicorns in Silicon Valley and the US, I think emerging markets actually offer the most opportunity for unicorns, mainly because there's so much market shift happening. And that market shift, that change, the development of new infrastructure tied to new behavior, tied to a massive change in a specific industry or consumer base, allows for a higher likelihood of a unicorn. I think the advantage that startups have going into these economies are that if you have a high value new technology that is fundamental to changing how something's done, whether it's internet access, whether it's commerce, for example, you can leapfrog the traditional progression of moving through legacy infrastructure and move straight to a new paradigm that allows massive amounts of growth, which one of Michael's startups has experienced. And I think you'll see a lot more unicorns happening outside the country, or outside the US, I should say, more than in the US in the next 3 to 5 years.
I would say a couple things. One is we're super excited about the growth in emerging markets, and the fact that many US investors are still a little bit scared or unwilling to get on a plane, I think presents a massive opportunity. These companies are great, and they're undervalued, and really talented folks. The other thing I would say is, if you look at the Silicon Valley-based startups, which is where I spend a lot of time thinking, or US-based startups in general, you can't build a unicorn without going overseas. You just can't do it. So all of these countries, companies that we think of as US companies, they're in all these countries. They're growing there. That's where most of their growth and most of their capital is being deployed. I think a lot about Uber. You can go anywhere and get an Uber. We're all in emerging markets, whether we start in Silicon Valley or not.
I would also say that there's very different kinds of problems and opportunities available to startups in countries that where they're focusing out in places other than the United States. I've been looking very closely at a lot of interesting companies that are focused on connectivity in places where there is not a lot of availability of data or broadband internet, for example, and looking into what are some of the interesting challenges that are unique to a particular market or region that would be considered emerging. And I think there's a ton of opportunity there for startups who can figure out what those problems are and solve them and scale them within other regions.
Yeah, and just to add on a comment, so I think we've recently seen some unicorns in India, for instance. Of course, China has been a massive market, and we even saw valuations increase heavily over the last 12 months. and definitely where companies are able to find a local solution, so localized for Indonesia, localized for India, localized for other emerging markets, the opportunity of becoming a unicorn is very big.
And Michael, do you just invest in Singapore companies, or do you also invest, do you care where the company's from?
Definitely. So we invest across Southeast Asia, which are the 6 main countries in the region. So that's Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, and Malaysia as well.
What about the rest of you guys? Do you focus on specific markets, or do you care where they come from?
Completely geographically agnostic. I think it's about the team and it's about the opportunity. We look at markets in the same way you might look at a portfolio of startups, in the sense that we try to both capitalize our investments across multiple markets, and I think we can source from any market. So we're very open.
I would say we are investing everywhere, and that presents some challenges. I think it's harder other places actually than the Middle East, and very much making the bet that some of the problems folks were talking about earlier in terms of liquidity and long-term outcomes are not actual problems, that we're going to see those outcomes and see those huge companies. So we want to make those bets now before other people realize that.
And at Samsung, we're certainly globally oriented. We actually changed the name of our division from Open Innovation Center to Global Innovation Center earlier this year to reflect that focus. But I think it's certainly true that there are some markets that are more attractive for early stage investment than others. And so we, certainly looking at things like political and economic and social risk associated with different markets, and focusing on the ones where there may be a little more stability.
And just a question on Samsung. Is Samsung investing in the same way that Google at least claims to, which is there's a separation between the corporate goals and the investing goals? Is it pure investing, or does it relate to Samsung's strategic goals as well?
We are not pure financial investors. So we obviously want our companies to do well, and we do well by them. But ideally, we are looking for opportunities that have some sort of strategic collaboration opportunity for a business unit, and we specifically focus on the Samsung Electronics division. So that's mobile, display, consumer electronics.
So I watched the panel before ours, which had the startups on it, and it was quite striking that pretty much all of the startups, I think it's true to say, bootstrapped in one way or another, sometimes for several years, including people not taking payment, and certainly not getting investments, neither locally nor from outside. And one's observation looking at 500 startups is a great example of the trend, but so is YC and others. There seems to be a very, very, very large number of startups these days. Each startup seems to get a very, very small amount of money, sometimes no money. And there's beginning to be discussion of multiple seed stages prior to institutional rounds. I think we should probably do a service to the startups by do some expectation setting. What does it actually mean today to get funding from outside or from inside at the early stage? What is the startup ecosystem like? How Darwinian is it? How brutal is it? What is the likelihood that they can get? The other presentation this morning talked about the gap in the middle. So there's all this seed capital and there's all this growth capital for the proven unicorns, and then there's a gap in the middle. Talk from your own experience. What advice would you give to startups how to think about their life cycle?
I mean, this has been a big problem for us, and it's frustrating because we invest in the seed stage, and these companies have an opportunity to grow, but not the capital necessarily to help them grow, and so they end up having to be more conservative, move towards profitability, and grow more slowly, which is really frustrating, but an opportunity, I think, for investors in the audience, because again, these companies, they're underpriced, they're really awesome. If they were in Silicon Valley, they'd just raise a boatload of money, but they're sitting in Lebanon or in Cairo or in other parts of the world, and it's very challenging for them.
And if you got nothing to say, don't. But I'm trying to provoke experiences so that you can share them with the audience. So if you've got some, share.
Well, we've seen some interesting developments in Southeast Asia. And I'll name an example without mentioning the company. So one of our portfolio companies, well funded, and at some point we were discussing with the founders, like, why are you leaving, home so early? To be honest, it's like, well, the train ride will take me about 45 minutes, and so I'll have to take the last train when I leave the office. And we're like, you're funded. Why don't you grab a cab home and be home in 10 minutes? So the mindset of these young startups, mostly first-time founders in Southeast Asia, is really, really different when you look at Western companies that will take an Uber straight away. So yeah, it's really, sometimes frustrating, working with these young founders that have like their first company and are not used to, working with outside capital. And it's one of the reasons why we try to focus on companies within the region, because we want to stay close to these founders and help them within all these different stages of funding.
No, I think for us it's about efficiency. I don't, even if you were funded $10 million in the bank, I still don't want you to have the perspective of making that, using that money freely. I believe that, the companies that have struggled, people that have built, that have lost money, that have failed, or that have gone a long time without, are the ones who are going to find more innovative solutions to problems. And I feel that they're more effective with their resources. And so, we provide funding up to $250,000 US, but we'll facilitate the next round of fundraising on behalf of the startups. And the idea behind it is that they don't know that money's coming per se. They know that there's a possibility there if they can reach their milestones, they can build the right things, and they know that we will help them do that. But I still want them to say, listen, you have money now, don't waste it, because if you do a good job here, you can continue to have a runway, and you will continue to have a sustainable business. I don't want to have anyone ever get in the idea of thinking that, oh, there's always more money out there, it doesn't really matter if I blow a little bit now because I can get more later. That's the thing we completely avoid. If we see that, we won't fund a company. At the same time, there's a balance between saying, listen, if a half an hour more time with Michael is more important than a $5 extra on a cab, then there's a value proposition there. So there's a balanced perspective of knowing when to spend the money properly, where the return will be worth it, but never actually being inefficient with that spend.
Just talk a little bit about domicility, like where a company is, in two different ways. The first is, do you want it to be a Delaware corporation, no matter where it is in the world, or do you care? Are there kind of 3 or 4 domiciles that are okay, but the rest aren't? How do you think about domicility? And then secondly, what about the founders? Do you ultimately want them to move from where they are to Silicon Valley, or are you happy they stay where you find them?
Delaware C Corp is great if we're going to go after U.S. investors for the follow-on round. It's a standard, it's there, it works. That said, we have investments in Thailand directly, in Singapore. We're looking at London right now, Ireland as well, Berlin. So I think we're agnostic as long as the right legal structures are there in place where we have the protection that we need to know that our investment isn't going to be lost somehow. Now, in terms of where they are physically located, I think they should be where they will do the most, have the most production. So if their team is local to, we have a team in Kuala Lumpur right now. They're working great, and we'll provide virtual tools to facilitate that. So I don't think location is a big deal. That said, at certain stages in the product, in the startup life cycle, being physically in a certain space for a period of time to meet certain people and have those relationships is important, and we'll facilitate that throughout the development of the companies. But I don't think the geographic requirement, or I don't think a geographic requirement is necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, we don't really care where companies incorporate, and I think something that's important to remember is you can always change it later. So we often see companies have this problem where they want to raise money in the US. There are a lot of funds that are restricted to Delaware C Corp, so they just create a Delaware C Corp, it becomes the parent company. So you can do those things after you get the business going. In terms of where the companies physically reside, I think the big question is where's their market? I think if their market is global, they tend to seed it wherever they're based and then open a US office. Often that's to scale sales marketing and so on, because the US is a big, obvious market to go after to scale. And it helps to be in the US because, again, there's more capital there. We often see teams building back office, engineering, and other sorts of functions wherever they were founded, if that talent is available, which is another question. So it really depends what kind of business you're building. If your market is regional, so we think a lot about the Arabic-speaking market as one market as opposed to a bunch of small countries. If you're going after that market, it doesn't make a ton of sense for you to be, for example, based in the US or Europe, though you might travel there and often specifically for fundraising or partnerships.
I would say that with regards to location, I think one of the biggest challenges for really early stage startups in emerging markets is just access to a network. You know, a lot of fundraising in particular is getting the right introduction to the right person at the right time and growing it from there. And I think on the positive side, there are you know, a growth, I think, in the number of angel investors that you're seeing really across regions. And those can be great, you know, opportunities for that early seed capital before you need to go out and find the institutional investors who may be in more developed markets. You know, I'm also an angel investor. I'm invested in a very successful company based in India. And they you know, travel back and forth frequently, the co-founders, but all of their staff is based there. You know, they operate you know, completely in that country, and so a lot of it is just, I think, mobility for the founders and those that need to travel to go, you know, develop and nurture the right relationships to keep the business going.
Yeah, so for us, location is definitely, it has become very important. So we've seen it the other way around, where initially our portfolio companies moved from Singapore to the US. Now there's so much inflow of venture capital into Singapore that companies actually re-domicile back to Singapore because easier fundraise to be in Singapore.
Interestingly enough, I've seen that in China as well. I keynoted a conference in China last year called Returning Scholars, and it was 5,000 people, many of them US, returning to China. And I think that's a trend happening because of the growth of the Chinese economy. It's going to happen a lot. What about you know, how you think about when you meet a company and you listen to their story? What role do these two things play? The first is traction. That is to say, what have you done so far? And the second is vision. How big could this be? Will you invest in strong ideas and vision prior to traction, or does traction play a really important role for you?
I think it depends on the type of company. I mean, at least at Samsung, you know, we're often looking at you know, very, very new and innovative technology that may be coming out of an R&D lab at a university. You know, at that stage, you're really looking for what is the unique technological differentiator of what these people are building, and could it potentially be commercially viable? But it may not be at this time. It's just very, you know, unique in the way that it's approaching, you know, a particular problem, if it's machine learning or something like that. So I think for us, it really depends on the vertical and what exactly, you know, this technology in particular can accomplish.
And for us, because we tend to look at less IP-based businesses, we look at traction, although I tend to think of it as more qualitative than quantitative. The fact that you're making money, the fact that you've gotten a market, it more reflects on the entrepreneurs. You've executed, you've done something, what have you learned, how do you think, more than are you making X dollars or Y dollars. I think with respect to the other part of that question about vision, I think one of the things that we've observed is if you're in Silicon Valley, people encourage you to think like crazy is a good thing. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs in regions such as the Middle East have been discouraged from thinking about crazy ideas and encouraged to think about smaller, more practical ideas. So I would say we spend time with these founders, you know, helping them revisit the crazy ideas that often have been beaten out of them in the process of building a very practical business and making money.
There's a great article in last week's New Yorker about Marc Andreessen.
Yeah.
And one of his entrepreneurs is quoted as saying, the guy's called Deepak, I can't remember which company he's from, is quoted as saying, average investors look for traction, great investors look for world-changing
I
ideas.
think that was the
We
Mix
want you to
panel
invent the future.
founder.
VIX panel founder, that's right. Yeah. So you don't obviously you don't want to be an average investor. So I've been suggesting that. You know?
I think Traction, we invest as early as even before founding, and we'll help form the company. So at that point, Traction isn't even a blip on the radar yet, right? But for me, it's the way someone thinks, it's the perspective, it's how they approach a problem, and I also think it's the experiences they've had, which also shaped how they approach future things. So I think Traction, building the revenue, getting all that's something we'll do with them as they grow. But up front, we're investing on an individual that has a unique perspective, that has a good approach, that has a good idea, and that idea has to be big enough to change whatever field they're going into. And maybe it doesn't start that way, but that's what we want to know, that they have this vision of where it needs to go, where it's going to go, and then we can help them, or if they have it already, figure out what that pathway is. And a lot of the startups I've actually met here have had interesting perspectives that I think play to that perspective, to that approach.
Just before Michael, you want to say something, Michael?
Yeah, quickly.
Just before you do, I'm going to come to the audience next. So if you have questions, now's the time to think about them, and just there's bright lights here, so I can't fully see you. So really wave your arm if you have a question, Michael.
Just quickly commenting. So what we've seen is you don't even have the luxury in emerging markets to find companies that have a lot of traction, because if they do, they're mainly well funded because everybody finds them because there are like a few companies that have a lot of traction. So you tend to look for a great founding team with a good vision, either for a local market, for a global market, for a regional market. But I think most of the VCs in emerging markets will look for great teams with a wonderful idea.
Although you can have good traction against a small idea,
Definitely.
which is you get trapped then in the small idea. For what it's worth, our Archimedes is very early, a little bit like Mike there. We have, all of our 14 companies have gone on to be invested by other people, but we got involved with them really at the product definition, storytelling, and prototyping stage. And our goal is to try to, we tell this story to entrepreneurs that a company is a little bit like writing a book. A book has a first chapter which proves you can write. It has a plot and it has an ending. And if you took the idea of the book to a publisher without having all of that in place, the publisher wouldn't give you money to write the book. They want to know the whole thing. And entrepreneurs kind of need to have a vision. They need to have done something, and they need to be able to tell you how what they've done is a step towards the end. And if they can do that, they already get 3 ticks in the boxes. And most entrepreneurs are so focused on operational realities of their current stage that they don't do that. So we really try to teach entrepreneurs how to become storytellers, advocates for their own idea, if you like, which is every one of these guys will tell you they take a lot of meetings where that doesn't happen, and it's kind of disappointing because you want to be blown off your feet by the next person who walks through the door.
Small comment on that is that I think that's important, because what it prevents is a need for a pivot. I think if you have that figured out early on, then you're not blowing a bunch of VC money and then trying to figure out a secondary backup way to make your business work. I think the pivot happens up front, so to speak.
Yeah. So let's turn to the audience. You've got some very interesting people here with lots of experiences. Paul, have we got time for?
Yeah, we have time. So please raise your hands, and while you do the first, I'm going to ask my first questions, because I only stepped out for 2 minutes, so I might have missed it. Something you might not have talked about is the regulatory and the labor laws, because it's great to say that any location works, but actually when you have to invest money into some markets, sometimes it's not as easy, and then if you talk only about the startup itself, some regulations about labor laws are really difficult. Lebanon, I know, for instance, there are some difficulties as well.
So we talked about domicility in general, but we didn't drill down as to why, but most of the answers were, that is not our primary concern. I must admit, I've been through the experience of changing the domicility of companies to US from a prior domicility, and it's a nightmare from an IP transfer point of view. But these days, there's more experience, and you can do it a bit easier than when I did it. But if I was being pragmatic and there's no penalty for doing it, I generally would start a Delaware Corp anywhere in the world.
So that's what I meant. Location is just not important. It can actually be.
So I guess the way I would look at that is, at the earliest stage, the growth opportunities are so big that thinking about cost optimization, which I think labor laws and labor costs are sort of in that bucket, are not as important as thinking about the market opportunity.
No, obviously, but you can act, as investors, as also advisors to these startups. Say, look, we know the realities of that market, and maybe even though it's not on your radar, it's something you'll have to think at some point.
We are an unusual
And then
group.
I will give you the, sorry. Because
I would say we're an unusual group. I mean, if you had Sequoia Capital, Kleiner Perkins,
obviously.
Accel, and Benchmark on this panel, they would probably express a lot more concerns about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but later.
Because they're later stage,
Correct.
and there's more at stake for them. So you got to contextualize who it is you're talking to.
No, of course. I was just thinking about how you also helps entrepreneurs, that you guys can give them these hints at the very early start. So I had a question, I think, over there, the first one, yeah.
And there are a lot of funds that are coming on board in Lebanon and more funds that are interested. And I won't say there's a glut of funding, but funding is becoming more available. But what we think is really important is around what the funders are bringing to the table other than the funds. And I'm just curious, in terms of you folks, how you think we can improve that process of the matchmaking, not just getting the funding to the startup, but how can we help improve that pairing so that we figure, much more enhanced benefits the startups can get from the right investors, who have the right network, the right background, almost a sort of selection process on both sides, rather than how it often is the startups always pitching to the investors, and the investors picking the startups. We want them to be picking on both sides.
But after that basic requirement is met, the growth, the traction, the chances of survival are more based on experience, know-how, execution, all those good things. And so I think if you're going to be deploying capital, especially from a state level, and anyway, it's 4.4 million people and $400 million, so the ratio is quite high. I think it's more, the money is, you have to look at it and say, what if the money was irrelevant, and what do we have besides the money? And I think the people that are providing the capital need to look at what else they're providing, because without that structure, without that know-how, without that execution, what you're going to be doing is funding a first round of startups that will mostly fail, and you are hoping that some of them will learn, and then the next tranche of money will go to building companies that are going to succeed. Now you'll have some outliers, but you want to avoid, if possible, avoid that initial inefficiency.
I would say there's a supply and demand aspect to it, and whereas in Silicon Valley and to some extent now in New York and a few other places, there's just a lot more capital than startups, so it's made the investors have to be a lot more honest. The other part of it, though, is there's a lot more communication. The founders are working together. They're talking about investors. Folks like yourself or folks like us, like we have standard documents and standard terms, and so does Y Combinator, and startups are using these. And so I think between those founder networks, our ability to directly advise the startups, and some of this legal infrastructure, there are defaults. And so you can create a system that makes it a little bit easier for startups to know who they're dealing with, know how they've dealt with people in the past, and start at least from standard terms. So I'd recommend you look at some of those strategies that have worked well in the Valley.
I always encourage founders to ask their potential investors, so what do you think you're bringing to the table beyond money? How are we going to work together? Certainly at Samsung, that's something that we talk about with all the companies that we meet with. What is it? Is it distribution? Is it hardware knowledge? What is it about what we have to offer that really fits and can support what you're doing? And that as an angel investor as well, that's something that I'm always talking to people about, because especially at the early stages, you really need to surround yourself with an investor group that is going to be supportive and helpful to you. Because I see a number of companies all the time that make bad decisions in terms of who their initial investors are, and that causes an incredible amount of headache later on. So I'm never insulted when an entrepreneur asks me, what else can you do for us? What will this relationship look like?
To quickly add on, so what we've done for our first 20 portfolio companies, these were all co-investments, and we've actually asked the founder, if you had a wish list, which other investor would you bring on board and why? And that actually helped create a better ecosystem as opposed to just doing a deal by yourself.
I think the other thing is you can see by talking to the founders of the companies that people already invested in, to what extent they do that. You have to do your due diligence. I would also say that an introduction to a potential later stage investor is actually a minor role. The bigger role is that you, when you walk into that meeting, have to be ready to win. And that isn't to do with the introduction. You can get, I introduced one of my companies yesterday. They asked for 6 introductions. I made all 6. 5 of them have already set up meetings with the company. In my opinion, the founder's asking for those meetings too early. And I think there's a good chance the meetings won't go well. And I've advised him of that, and he's very strong-willed and he wants to do the meetings anyway. And, so really the value of an introduction is relative to what it is you're actually selling and how viable it is. And that's down to your product, your vision, your execution, and you yourself personally. And no investor can give you those things. They can tell you need them and help you get them. And that's probably the most valuable thing they can do for you, not the introductions.
I'm going to overrule what I was just said. I'm still going to take one question, sorry, Sander, because of the interest. Will only be one question, provided the question is short, and provided your answers are short, otherwise it's unfair for the next panel. Do not forget, you can talk to all these guys during the breaks. Our table set up on purpose at networking. So go ahead, sir, quickly, please.
Okay, this early stage startup comes in, pitches, and what I want to know is what state of mind are you in at this point? Do you have like a secret checklist in your head that the startup has to go through, or is it like an emotional thing that, okay, I like the founder, so why not? And you start looking for answers on why to invest. So actually the question is, what state of mind will you be in usually?
Let's do it quick and I'll start. You want to fall in love with the person doing the pitch, metaphorically speaking, and the idea. It's the person and the idea, and you literally want to fall in love with them because you want to work with them for the next 5 years. And if they can't make you do that, they failed.
Michael?
I'll stay in this metaphor. We're looking for a team that will marry for the next 7 to 10 years. So that's what we're looking for.
I can tell within the first 2 minutes of the meeting whether or not we're going to move forward or not.
I would say look for people who are smart, because you can't fix stupid, who have a passion for the thing they're working on, who are going to do it for the next 10 years, because that's what it takes, and most startups fail when founders give up. And if they win, it matters. So that's where the big vision comes in.
Mike can have the closing words.
Passion, perspective, and value. I want it to come across when I meet them. It may not be in the first 2 minutes, it may be in the first 20 minutes or maybe longer, but if that isn't there, isn't driven from them, then everything else is irrelevant. So that's my first, like, if that's there, then there's a shot. If not, then there's none.
So it's emotional.
Yeah, we can see that. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you.